looking to buy or have just bought your new DSLR camera? If you are, then you've come to the right place, because today I'm going to tell and show you how to use a DSLR camera for beginners. These pieces of equipment are technical, they're expensive, and they're quite complicated, meaning if you've invested in one, you want to know the best ways to use it, and today is going to be laying down those basic building blocks to taking awesome photos. Today I have a DSLR camera with me I'm going to be using to demonstrate and show you how to do certain functions. This is the Canon 7D Mark II. It is not for sale anymore, however it has all the features we need to learn how to use a camera. Now with a DSLR camera, what makes it different from a bridge camera, a phone camera, or any compact camera is that it can change lenses. So you see here, you can take the lens off, and behind me I have a wide range of other lenses. I have a wide lens here. There is also a medium telephoto lens, and my biggest lens is a super telephoto lens. And that means one camera body can serve all the functions you need it to serve while maintaining that amazing DSLR quality. On the back of the camera you will have an LCD screen. In modern cameras this is often a flip out screen. On this camera it is built in. Then you will have an arrangement of buttons which will vary depending on the camera. On the top you will generally have a wheel. This will allow you to scroll through settings. You will have a shutter button and potentially a display. There will be a hot shoe. I have a hot shoe protector, but here you can see the hot shoe on top. And then the flash, which will pop up in most cameras, but some cameras it is a manual pop-up. On the side you simply have the camera details to say what model of camera it is, and a button to release the lens. That is the general setup of most cameras. Now I am using a Canon and I shoot with Canon, so if you do not use a Canon, some of these things will vary, however, the broad topic remains the same. So now you know the anatomy of the camera. Next, it is time to turn it on. And this means we can start using it. Now, if you are a total beginner, I would recommend using an automatic setting for about a week. Don't worry about using the settings, just get used to the feel of the camera. The automatic setting will generally have an A and potentially a plus. On Canon models, it is shown with an A. You should be able to find it pretty simply, and if you're using a modern camera that has a menu which guides you, you will see an automatic setting. By putting it on that automatic setting, your DSLR camera becomes very similar to a phone camera. You see, the camera will make all of the decisions for you, so all you have to do is point and shoot. The cameras are very intelligent nowadays and will make good decisions to get a good photo, so you don't have to worry about that. And it means that you will get some nice photos, you'll get used to the feel and your range, because when you come to using a lens, your focal range will vary, and getting used to that range that you have on the focal length is a very good idea. So now you've used the lens for about a week, purely using the automatic settings. You're used to handling the camera, you're used to how it feels in your hand, and you've seen some of the photos that the camera is able to take on an automatic setting. Next, it's time to start choosing how you use the camera to make it do exactly what you want it to do. Now, on a camera, there is 3 essential settings that you need to know about. There is 1, shutter speed, 2, aperture, and the third one is ISO. These 3 components come into whatever photo you are taking and will impact the result. Think of one setting, master it, before you move on to the next setting. The first setting I would use would be shutter priority mode. This mode is a mode where you only have to choose your shutter speed. You do not have to worry about the rest of the settings. This means it's not purely automatic. You are still using your brain power to create the images you like, but you're only thinking about one thing at a time to start with. It's like anything, it's best to start simple. To select this mode, you want to find the mode which has a TV. This is shutter priority mode, where you will control the shutter, but nothing else. Now, at the beginning I mentioned the dial on the top of the camera to control the settings. Well, this dial is now your shutter speed control. If you scroll it from the left to the right, it's going to increase your shutter speed. If you scroll it from the right to the left, it's going to decrease your shutter speed. So how does this impact an image? Well, the shutter is like a door that sits over the sensor. You see, the sensor opens to take an image. As long as the sensor is open, it's taking in light and an image from the outside of the camera, wherever the sensor is pointing. If this sensor is open for a long time, it's going to take in a lot of light, and you're going to get an image, and it's going to take everything in from that image for a long time. Now, if you move the camera, or the subject moves, that means while the sensor's open, it's going to blur across the image, and you'll get a blurry image. A high shutter speed means the shutter will open and allow the sensor to take a quick look at what's in front of the camera before it shuts again. And this means that a quicker shutter speed will not allow the picture to change that much while the shutter's open, meaning it will freeze the motion. So I hope you understood that explanation. The simple way of putting it is, the faster the subject is moving, or the longer your lens or the more you are moving, the higher the shutter speed you need. A high shutter speed will freeze an image. A low shutter speed will not freeze an image. So, after you've explored the shutter priority for a bit and you've got used to increasing or decreasing the shutter speed depending on the situation, we're now moving on to aperture. Aperture is the AV mode on the top of the camera. This means now you don't have to worry about shutter speed. You just need to worry about the aperture. Similarly, the shutter speed dial will now have become an aperture dial. This means similarly, if you go from left to right, the aperture will increase, and if you go from right to left, the aperture will decrease. Now, what is aperture? Aperture is the blur that you will see in a photo. It is that depth of field which you cannot get on a phone camera. How do you achieve that? You achieve that by having a low f-stop. With aperture, the lower the f-stop, the more the background will be blurred out. And that's it, really. Now, some cameras are not able to achieve such a blurry background because they may not be able to go to such a low aperture. But the lower the aperture, the more blur you can get. So, now we're going to talk about when you want to use aperture and what you should practice. When you're taking a portrait such as this, you want a blurry background. You want the subjects in focus, obviously. However, the background is not important to this image. You want to blur it out to make it soft and creamy. It'll make a lovely photo. This is because you have a small depth of field and the subject isn't moving or anything, so you can have that small depth of field on their face and the background can just be blurred out. However, there are times where you don't want that to happen. There are times where you want a higher aperture, and this will be if something's coming towards you, or if you're doing a landscape, you've got a bigger thing to focus on. Now, predominantly I am a wildlife photographer, meaning I spend a lot of time outside taking photos of wildlife, and quite often this wildlife can be in a poorly lit situation, meaning a low aperture also allows more light in. Just like a low shutter speed, it allows more light into the camera, as opposed to a high shutter speed which allows less light into the camera. So if I want more light into the camera because it's not such a good condition, then I'm going to shoot on a low aperture unless I have a bird flying towards me, for example. This means that I'm going to have a higher aperture because if the depth of field is too small, that bird is not going to be fully in focus when it comes to taking the photo. Another example of a higher aperture would be for landscape photography. If you're taking a photo of a beautiful house on a hill, well, you want it to all be in focus. And so now we're going to move on to the third and final component. This is ISO. Now, ISO is something where there isn't a setting for it. You don't control the ISO by choice unless you go fully manual. And that's why we've been doing it one by one, so then we can put them together and add in ISO all at once. It's a fairly big jump, but you will get used to it very quickly, and there is a little hack which I use to make it easier. ISO is simply artificial lightening of the image. If you have a high shutter speed, that means your shutter isn't allowing much light into the camera. If you similarly have a high aperture, then that's also not allowing much light into the camera. In a situation like this, you may not have much light entering the camera even in a well-lit environment, and this is when ISO comes into play. ISO is very handy because it lights the image up artificially. It adds in light to your photo. So, in a darker environment, it will add in artificial light to make your image bright. This is good, and it really helps out when you need an extra bit of light because you don't want to put the aperture any lower, or you can't, and you don't want to decrease the shutter speed. The only issue is, and I'm sure you've seen it before, you may end up with a grainy image because ISO not only adds in light, the consequence of doing this means you get noise as well, and noise is not ideal in an image. Now most cameras go from an ISO of 100 up to 25,000 or something, which you're never going to use unless you're really desperate, but the base is 100, and that is the ISO you want to aim for in every photo. You see, with ISO you want it to be as low as possible. You want to use external light, you don't want the camera to add it in itself, and you don't want a noisy image. So, whenever you're setting your ISO, you want it to be at 100 if possible. However, this is not always possible. Sometimes you have to increase it, and increasing it up to 400, up to 800, 3200 is pushing it a bit, 6400 I say is the limit if you want a decent photo. However, it's up to you. If you want a well-lit image which is still relatively clean, an ISO of about 400 is a good amount, and if you can get it down to 100, definitely do. So now I've talked about the three main components. What happens when you put them together? Now this is where it gets complicated. Like anything, we've learned the individual bits. Putting them together means you have to relearn everything essentially. Now as we've talked about, a low shutter speed allows in lots of light. A high shutter speed doesn't allow in lots of light. Similarly, a low aperture allows in lots of light and a high one doesn't. Now when it comes to taking a photo, as you may notice, I've been talking about light this whole time because essentially you're capturing light. A camera will take the light being reflected off the subject into its sensor and make the image. So light is key to photography. If you have a high aperture and a high shutter speed, that means you're not going to have much light entering the camera, as we talked about, and your ISO is going to be higher. However, if you have a low aperture and a low shutter speed, that means you're not going to need a high ISO because you have lots of light coming into the camera. And dialing all of these into the camera can be a bit complicated. Now, as I mentioned, the dials on your camera, one on the top, and potentially you might have one on the back, otherwise there'll be a button to press while you spin the dial. Getting used to how these feel and how to alter each of the settings individually is key, because in an environment where you have to take a photo, you want to know off by heart how to just quickly change the settings without having to think too hard about it. The combinations of these settings, as I've explained, is pretty simple when you think about it in your head. As soon as you have to put those numbers into the camera, it might get complicated. However, you can definitely do it. After a bit of practice, it just comes naturally. You will be changing the camera depending on what you're seeing in any environment before you know it. And it's not that complicated at the end of the day once you put the pieces together. And so now I've told you about how it all works, I'm going to show you how to actually use these settings, because so far you've got an automatic setting, you've got a shutter and an aperture priority. To make it so that you can use all of these settings individually and control them however you like, you go onto a manual setting. This is represented by an M on a Canon camera and most other brands. So again, press down the button and turn it to M, which means I now have control. The camera is not doing anything for me. I control the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Now I did mention a little hack earlier, and if you're still here watching, thank you very much, and you're going to be rewarded by knowing this hack. And it's very simple. On manual setting, you can put the ISO on automatic. This means that you still only have to worry about the aperture and the shutter speed, and the camera will do the ISO for you in a pressured environment. When I'm doing wildlife photography, I have very little time to assess the environment, set the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO. It all gets a bit complicated. However, having an automatic ISO means the camera will read the environment and add in just about the right amount of light to make the image correct. The danger comes when you have a high shutter speed and a high aperture, and then the camera automatically adds in too much. Not too much, it adds in the right amount to make the photo an exposed photo. However, it adds in too much that there's too much grain, and you might as well not have taken the photo. To stop doing this, all you have to do is set a maximum aperture on your camera. This means it will go up to a point and no further. That is my hack. That is what I do to keep the ISO nice and easy, and the rest of the settings I control. Now I'm very excited to announce we are running up to 1,000 subscribers, which is a huge milestone for me and this YouTube journey. We've been here for almost 2 years now, and the progress has been incredible, and we are so close. We are 37 subscribers away from reaching 1,000, so if you haven't subscribed, please do. And if you know anyone else who hasn't, if you have any family members who you think could benefit from seeing this channel, please share the videos or the channel itself, because I'm sure it would benefit them to see, and it would help us reach 1,000. And so, as I said at the beginning of the video, today I've given you a very basic understanding of how your new or soon-to-be new DSLR camera will work. It is very basic, and you can go out and practice these skills, and you will learn things for yourself, or you can watch other videos, you can go see my vlogs, all the videos that I do. I drop hundreds of tips about how to use a camera and how I do it in the real world. So I hope you enjoyed today's video, I hope you learned something, and you now have the ability to go away as a better photographer. If you have any more questions, put them in the comments down below, and I will do a part 2 or an extended video where I talk about photography in more detail and how to do specific things such as wildlife photography. If you want to see more and you've enjoyed today's video and you would like to help other people see today's video, then drop a like, subscribe, and check out the links in the description to my Instagram, my shop, and my website. I'd love to see you there. So with all that being said, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.